Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad you could join me today. And if you were with me last time, you know I started an episode that I'm calling Why You've Struggled So Much with Sex. And actually, this is a session from the Power of Purity Conference. It's session number 26, and I'm just kind of going through some of that session here on the podcast because I think the content is can be very helpful in helping guys understand themselves better than they've ever understood themselves before, and really to understand kind of the origins of the struggle that they've had with the issue of sex. So many of us, as I said last time, have struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled, and we don't know why is this struggle so difficult. And I believe if you stick with me through this session, you're going to understand yourself better than you ever have before, and understand, as the title says, why you've struggled so much with sex. And the thesis of this session is this: when you understand the very unhealthy ways that your sexuality developed, you'll understand why you've struggled so much with sex. And I started last time with two different metaphors to kind of set the stage. The first one was the concept of the birth of sexuality. Every boy goes through this transition from being a boy to becoming a man. We call that puberty. And it's God's will and design, we learn, that a boy's transition from boyhood to manhood should happen ideally in the context of innocence. But unfortunately, in this day and age in which we live, and this highly sexualized culture in which we live, it's virtually impossible for a boy's sexuality to be born and to grow in the context of innocence. The second metaphor I gave was that of the cake and the concept of ingredients. The cake that comes out of the oven is predicated upon the ingredients that get put into the cake, right? You put good ingredients in a cake mix, then the cake comes out of the oven is going to be good. You put bad ingredients in the cake mix, the cake that comes out of the oven is going to be bad. And in this metaphor, I'm suggesting that the birth and development of a boy's sexuality is kind of like the cake mix. There's a kind of sexual cake mix. And often the way a person ends up practicing and experiencing their sexual gift is predicated upon the ingredients that get mixed into the recipe of their sexual self at this very vulnerable and impressionable a time of sexual development. And I was just beginning to take a look. I said, let's take a look at just an average boy in America and consider some of the ingredients that typically get put into the sexual cake mix of this boy, this average boy, as he processes through puberty and he's changing from a boy into a man. And I only made it into one of these ingredients so far, and we talked about porn last time. The average boy finds porn at the age of 11 or 12, and I just talked about how profoundly influential that is and how damaging it can be to a young boy. So porn is absolutely a horrible ingredient to have put into the cake mix for a young boy. Imagine if you're making a cake and all the ingredients are good, but somebody comes along and just puts in one bad ingredient, maybe a half cup of gasoline. Well, just the power and influence of pornography alone is enough to profoundly, significantly influence the development of a young boy's sexuality. But unfortunately, porn isn't the only adverse ingredient that gets put into the cake mix. Porn is number one, but that brings us to the second ingredient I want to mention, which for the lack of a better name, I'm just calling the locker room. And by the locker room, I mean essentially the influence of the guys within a boy's peer group. And along with the locker room comes the concept of locker room talk. And this concerns the coarse, crude, and often sexualized dialogue and banter among junior high, high school, and college-age guys. You know how guys just kind of tease, and guys joke, and guys tend to be braggadocious, and they banter with one another. And this often includes exaggeration. They talk big. They lie to each other about their sexual experiences, I guess in the attempt to try to impress one another or prove their manhood to one another. So porn is the first bad ingredient. Second is the locker room and locker room talk. A boy is kind of being influenced by his peer group and the guys around him and the way the guys are talking and what they're talking about. And this is impacting him and kind of shaping who he's becoming and how he's beginning to think about the topic of sex and about women. The third ingredient is what I call role models. And I've mentioned before that the way God set this thing up is that masculinity is caught. It's not taught. Boys learn how to be men by essentially watching the senior male role models in and around their lives, older brothers and cousins and guys in the neighborhood and uncles and grandpas, certainly their fathers. And so they watch these older male role models and they're learning what a man is. They're learning how a man thinks about sex, how a man looks at women, the attitudes men have toward women and sex, how to talk to women. And the point is, you guys, that for many boys, the primary role models of their lives often provide very ungodly examples of both masculinity and sexuality. For example, and I'm just going to mention a few, but every one of these is real, okay? The boy who finds his pornography in triple X-rated books, maybe when he's 10, 11, 12 years old. What about the boy who's aware of his father's sexual philandering and duplicities? What about the boy whose uncle takes him at the age of 13 to a prostitute so he can become a man? The boy whose uncle gives him access to the stash of pornography in the back room of the barber shop. The boy whose older brothers teach him how to have sex with animals. Or the boy whose older cousin teaches him how to masturbate. The boy who receives oral sex for the first time in his life from the troop leader at the Boy Scout camp. And on and on it goes. So now we see that role models can often be a very bad ingredient that's getting put into a boy's sexual cake mix. And then we come to the ingredient of generational issues. And the Bible has a lot to say about things like strongholds, bondages, curses, familiar spirits. And these things are granted access to a boy's life and soul through the gateway of familial ancestry and generational sin. I believe that in my personal case, generational issues were a big part of my deep struggle with the issue of sex. And I had to do some deep, significant, profound, mysterious, spiritual work around these generational issues and identify some forces that were attached to my life and renounce those things by the power of Christ, the light of Christ, the truth of Christ, the blood of Christ, and those things need to be renounced. So these generational issues can be another bad ingredient that's getting put into the sexual cake mix. The next ingredient is the issue of sexual abuse. In a recent article from the American Psychological Association, they estimate that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused by the age of 18, although the statistics for boys are probably much higher because males don't tend to report victimization as much as females do. But, for example, the boy who's seduced by his pastor into his first homosexual experience. The young teenage boy who's seduced by an older woman while babysitting at their house. That's what happened to me. The boy who's required to perform oral sex on his cousin or his uncle. The boy who has intercourse for the first time with his own mother and is told that she's teaching him how to be a man. And on it goes. So sexual abuse certainly is a terrible ingredient to put into the sexual cake mix for those guys who have experienced sexual abuse. And then there's the ingredients of the cultural norms and attitudes that surround all of us in the culture in which we are living, including boys and girls. This would include the widespread practice, for example, of sexting, the acceptance and prevalence of oral sex, starting at a very alarmingly young age, typically with junior high school students, sexual permissiveness in general, the widespread acceptance of bisexuality and homosexuality is accepted, and appropriate lifestyle alternatives. And in addition, there's almost endless cultural dynamics and nuances, right, that are more bad ingredients. Things like Victoria's Secret catalogs, Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. There's the whole issue of the spring break phenomena in places like Panama City, Florida, and Cancun, Mexico, among other destinations. By the way, an estimated 500,000 college students descend upon Panama City, Florida each year for spring break. Among college females who go to spring break, 83% drink. Virtually 100% of the males drink. It's estimated the average male on spring break consumes 18 alcoholic beverages per day. The average female consumes 10 alcoholic beverages per day. And many of them drink to the point of literally passing out. 74% of females who attend spring break participate in increased sexual activity while at spring break. 50% of all sexual encounters at spring break are random and unplanned, and 50% of all sexual encounters are unprotected sex. So certainly this whole phenomena of spring break is an ingredient that's getting put into young people's hearts and lives that is not helpful. And then there's various expressions of the media, including things like television and movies, MTV, right? A few statistics. American children spend more than 38 hours per week using media. This includes television, videos, music, computers, and video games. The average child spends more time using media every day than any other activity of their life except for sleep. The average teen is exposed to 14,000 sexual references or scenes per year on television alone. On average, music videos contain 93 sexual situations per hour, including 11 hardcore scenes depicting behavior like intercourse or oral sex. 70% of the top 20 shows watched by teenagers contain sexual content. Between 1998 and 2005, the number of sexual scenes on television doubled. Studies reveal that 66% of boys want to try the sexual behaviors that they view through the media. Hello. Of course, a boy's watching this stuff. He's seeing these scenes. He's watching pornography, and it's embedded in him. Of course, I want to try that. I want to do that with a real live flesh and blood girl, you know. Studies reveal that the high levels of sexual content on television and explicit music lyrics increase the likelihood of teenage sexual activity. And all of these statistics are, by the way, are taken from an article called Sex, the Media, and Your Child, which was produced by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And finally, if all of this stuff isn't enough, all these different ingredients that are getting put into a boy's sexual cake mix, if all this isn't enough, I want to add one final ingredient that I think has significant influence and contributes to the early disorientation and brokenness of this average American boy's sexual self, and that's what I'm simply calling the flesh. And the flesh in the Bible is also referred to as the old nature, the old man, the carnal nature, the lower nature, the sin nature, the Adam nature, the earthly nature, whatever you want to call it. I'm calling it the flesh. It's that part of every human being, that part of our fallen and sinful nature that essentially compels us to sin. It compels us to disobey God. It's that thing that compels us to do something that's wrong when we really want to do it, even though that we know that it's wrong and God doesn't want us to do it. And it's often in violation of our very own conscience, we go ahead and do it anyway. And I would suggest that in the same way a building stands on the foundation on which it's built, right? The flesh, in a sense, serves as a kind of foundation to every person's life. Without God, we have the foundation of the flesh. And this sexual disorientation and the sexual dysfunction that comes to exist in so many of our lives is built upon this foundation of the flesh, you see. So I think the flesh is a very significant ingredient that's influencing the development of our sexual selves. Galatians chapter 5, verse 16 and 17 says, "So I say, walk in the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." In fact, in just the next few verses of this very same passage, Paul goes on to give a metaphor of this concept of the flesh by talking about fruits. In the passage, he talks about fruits of the Spirit, but he also talks about fruits of the flesh. And a tree makes fruit, right? An apple tree makes apples, an orange tree makes oranges. So in this metaphor of the flesh, it's like the Apostle Paul is saying, if your flesh, that carnal part of who you are as a human being, was a tree, the metaphor of a tree, well, the tree of the flesh is producing fruit in your life. And Paul exposes or names 17 different fruits of the flesh, and something that I think is very profound and very significant. Isn't it a coincidence that of these 17 fruits of the flesh, the very first 4 that he names all are sexual in nature, which I think is significant. I believe it indicates that it's like the immediate and most natural inclination and instinct of the sinful flesh is going to be sexual in nature. And here the passage is Galatians chapter 5, verse 19 through 21. I'm going to read it, but then I'm going to come back and talk about these 4 for just a moment. He says, "Now the fruits of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such as the like, of which I tell you before, as I have also told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God." So as I mentioned, isn't it interesting that out of this list of 17 fruits of the flesh, the first 4 are all sexual in nature? He mentions adultery, fornication, uncleanness, and lasciviousness. Well, we know what adultery is, right? That's when you have sex with someone other than your spouse in the context of marriage. Fornication is when you have sex, you're sexually active outside of marriage. You are not married, but you're having sex anyway. That's fornication. But then he names uncleanness and lasciviousness. And I'm telling you guys, if you want to do just a really intriguing, interesting study, just look up these words. I don't know if you're accustomed to that. I do not claim to be an expert in the original languages at all, but I use my Greek dictionary, I use the Strong's Concordance, and I love to look up these words. And I'm telling you that sometimes it's the difference between like watching TV in black and white. If you can even relate to that, some of you guys probably aren't even old enough to understand what watching TV in black and white was versus watching in color. You read the Bible, it's like black and white, but when you get into the meaning of these words, it's amazing how it colors the passage, and it really helps you understand what's being said. So again, the four fruits, the first four fruits are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, and lasciviousness. Well, when you look up this word uncleanness, it's a word that has a moral connotation. It's referencing a person's morality, and it specifically means the impurity of lust or profligate living. Profligate living. And I didn't know what that meant, so I looked up the word profligate, and it means the reckless or extravagant or wasteful use of something. So uncleanness specifically references the impurity of lust or a lust-filled heart and life. And then the fourth word he mentions is even more colorful. It's the word lasciviousness. And it's quite an interesting word. The definition of the word is this: lasciviousness is unbridled lust, excessive lust, licentiousness, lasciviousness, wantonness, outrageousness, shamelessness, or insolence. And I began to look up each one of these words because I didn't know what most of them mean. And it's amazing. Every one of them has a sexual overtone or connotation. That's what lasciviousness is. Lasciviousness, again, is unbridled lust or excessive lust. Licentiousness means promiscuous and unprincipled concerning sexual matters. Lasciviousness is a person who demonstrates an overt and often offensive sexual desire. Wantonness is self-indulgent and lewd flirtation. Outrageousness is grossly offensive to the sense of what's right and wrong. See, it's a willingness to violate a sense of right and wrong. Shamelessness, of course, simply means a lack of shame, and insolence means to be rude or disrespectful in one's behavior. So when Paul says that the fruits of the flesh, the first four he names, adultery, fornication, uncleanness, and lasciviousness, it's just amazing the sexual overtone. And again, I believe the fact that he mentions these four first indicate that the immediate and most natural inclination and instinct of the flesh that lives in human beings is often sexual in nature. Well, with all that being said, guys, I come to a little vignette that I'll just call a stacked deck. You know when the deck is stacked against you? So I want to ask this question. With all this stuff going on around this boy, this average American boy, all these ingredients are getting put into his sexual cake mix beginning at the age 10, 11, 12, 13. These ingredients are getting put in, right? Ingredients like pornography and sexual abuse and the locker room talk and role models and generational issues and then the cultural norms and standards, Victoria's Secret and Sports Illustrated and Spring Break and all the cultural attitudes concerning sexting and pornography and all this crazy stuff that kids are exposed to. Do you see how the deck is stacked against a young boy before he even has a chance? Does he have any chance to be a young man of purity? Does he have any chance for his sexual self to be born in this context of innocence, which God would intend? You see that the deck is stacked so much against the average kid, it's just unbelievable. You see, he's only a kid, right? And God's plan for his life involves sexual purity and holiness and self-control. And all of this is intended to be developed in the context of innocence. But in reality, the average American boy has almost a zero possibility of achieving sexual purity in his young life, because at such a young age, he already has all these significant forces aligning themselves against him and the possibility of his sexual purity. Or said another way, in the verbiage of the cake and ingredients metaphor, remember, when you put good ingredients in a cake, a good cake comes out of the oven. When you put bad ingredients in a cake, a bad cake comes out of the oven. So let me ask you, what do you think the chances are that this young man is going to have a struggle with his sexual self, with issues of sexual purity, with all these bad ingredients that are getting stirred into the cake mix of his sexual self at the age of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15? You're putting bad ingredients, bad ingredients, bad ingredients. You're putting a little gasoline in the cake mix. You're putting a little rat poison and lawn fertilizer and paint thinner and God only knows what else. All these bad ingredients. And by the way, let me remind you of the thesis of this little talk at this point. I said our thesis is this: when you understand the very unhealthy way that your sexuality developed, you'll understand why you've struggled so much with sex. And so now what I want to do is talk a little bit about this metaphorical boy. I want to ask a very important question. This boy that had all these ingredients put into his self, how is all this going to impact this young boy? How is it going to influence the progress of this young man's life and sexuality as he goes through puberty and he's going through this transition and metamorphosis from a boy into a man? Because you see, in reality, the reality is that this young man who is having all these bad ingredients and influence mixed into the development of his sexual self is going to grow up from a boy into a man. So what I'd like to do now is take a look for a moment, a metaphorical look at the life of this average boy to illustrate how all these various ingredients that are being sown into his life might be affecting him and shaping him as he develops, his sexuality is developing, and he's growing and transitioning from a boy into a man. And in order to do that, I want to consider a series of 10 steps. I've kind of identified 10 pieces of a puzzle that I would advocate are very common in most boys' lives and situations, if not all boys, okay? And the first one is this. So we're gonna talk about 10 steps. Well, I'll tell you what. You know what I'm noticing, guys? I'm right at my 30-minute mark. And so since I'm just getting ready to start the 10 steps, I might suggest that this is a good point to interrupt this episode. So I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and wrap it up today. But I hope you'll be able to come back for our next episode. We're going to get into these 10 steps. And I promise you guys, if you stay with me, you're going to understand yourself better than you ever have before. And as the title of this episode states, you're going to understand why you've struggled so much with sex. Thanks a lot for being with me today. I'll look forward to seeing you guys in our next episode. God bless.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.